Hello, everyone. I'm Anatol Lieven, Director of the Eurasia Programme here at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. For those of you who don't know us, the Quincy is a fairly, in fact, a very new institute by Washington standards, and we are dedicated to the promotion of restraint in US foreign and security policy and peace and cooperation, insofar as these can be achieved, between the major countries of the world. Today, it's a great pleasure to introduce Marlene Laruelle. Marlene is Professor of International Affairs and Political Science and Director of the Illiberalism Studies Program at George Washington University. She is author of several leading books on Russia and Russian thought, including Russian Eurasianism, an Ideology of Empire, and Is Russia Fascist? Unraveling Propaganda East and West. And today we will be discussing Marlene's latest book, published in January, Ideology and Meaning-Making Under the Putin Regime. Marlene, welcome. Great pleasure to talk to you today.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
So in your book, you talk about the co-creation of ideology from above and below. In other words, the ideology, or rather ideologies, because you stress the plurality of them in Russia today, are not simply a creation of the regime, but they are created as the product of a whole series of dialogues between the regime, Russian intellectual society, and indeed Russian society more broadly, and Russian history. Putin is not, you would say, a theoretical thinker. He's not, from that point of view, a Lenin or, God forbid, a Stalin, or even, I thought, actually reading your book, a Mussolini, who actually did try to put together a coherent ideology. He's more of a jackdaw who picks up whatever he thinks will be useful, obviously, to his regime, but also to the Russian state. I've often said about Putin myself that a phrase that sums him up is something that Keynes said about Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France at the Versailles Peace Conference, that Clemenceau was a deeply cynical politician, totally disillusioned about the world in general and his own fellow countrymen, a man who had only one illusion, France. And that, it's often seemed to me, is the case with Putin. He does have an illusion of Russia, if it is an illusion. So could you say something about the different pieces or he's picked up, or streams from which the regime has drunk to put together this tesseract of different ideological positions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first point you mentioned, the one about the fact that it's a co-created ideological kind of universe, is really important, because first it helps us understanding how long the regime can function and how much it can be in harmony, at least with part of the society. So I think the longevity element of Putin's in power is very much linked to that capacity to co-create. Then, as you said, he's not alone. He's not himself an ideologist. We know he's reading history books, so it's something that matters for him, but it's more the kind of lived experience of historical figures than it is about any kind of doctrine. He has people around him. And on that, I think there is this co-creational aspect also among the elites, right? Russian academic elites, Russian public intellectual elites, Russian administrative elites. And in fact, we know a lot about the downstream aspects. So once something has been kind of presented as being the official language, then there are a lot of people around the system that are developing the idea. We know less about the upstream, that is how ideas are arriving to him and to the inner circles, who are the little hands who are reading, commenting, reporting, and how all this kind of, kitchen of adjustment of which narratives to take and how to shape that we know less. But usually we tend to conflate the upstream and the downstream aspect, right? And in fact, we know the downstream is easy to study, the upstream is not so much. And then the co-creational aspect is really also with the society. And I think for that, we have to remember, what was the Russian society thinking in the 90s? the Russian society was already asking for something that looked like some form of what we had under Putin already at the time where Russia was had a government that was much more pro-liberal, pro-Western. So I think in a sense, the social demands we had in the 19th around, Zyuganov, Communist Party, Zhirinovsky, the LDPR that looks as oppositional at that time just became the mainstream and the new official kind of doctrine. So I think the society was asking for a lot of these aspects of, social justice, law and order, a narrative, a storytelling on the nation, on the great power restoration. And then gradually the regime the institution were able to build that. But I think the co-creational aspects remain. And of course, we can discuss about, level of repression and how much the society is still really able to test different counter narratives. But I think at the core of the Russian authorities, we have that capacity of, listening to some elements coming from the Russian society, their demands. We know they do a lot of surveys of public opinion. They know how to co-opt cultural figure. They know how to co-opt all the kind of underground atmosphere of the Russian societies. And on that, they try to build something that looks to speak to at least a majority of the society. And of course, those who share minority view can feel in a more kind of a marginalized position. But I think the co-creational aspect explains the longevity of the system as it is, and also its capacity to adapt to changing situations like the war.
Yes, and it seems that as long as you are loyal to the state as defined by Putin, and as long as you support the war in the sense of not calling for a peace of surrender, there are because this is a co-created process, there are these very different streams, all of which the regime has sort of embodied to some extent, but which are often in pretty deep tension with each other. So, you have, well, even within the idea of the Russian world, you have an ethnic version of that, and you have simply a cultural version of it. You have definite strains of Russian imperialism, whether part of the Eurasian discourse or not. But that, of course, sits pretty badly with the anti-colonial discourse, which has been so important to reaching out to the global south. On the other hand, it's not incompatible with civilizationism, in the sense of, the world being made up of equal, multiple civilizations, which is so useful in pushing back against the West. And all of these kind of jostle with each other, right? But because none of them are, explicitly. And then you still have. And then you have the conservative Europeanists, who still regard Russia as part of Europe, although a different part, but as still want to reach out to sympathetic people in the West. And then you have the real hardliners who say, no, the break with the West is definitive. It doesn't matter what the West throws up. And that's why perhaps it's not right, as you have written before, to see Russia as a totalitarian regime. More perhaps like 19th century Russia, in which, as long as you were loyal to the state and didn't actually try to overthrow the Tsar, a wide range of different versions of identity was permitted. Is that correct, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't see Russia as a totalitarian society. I think indeed there has been a growing coherence of the state language, especially after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, where they really spent time in trying to put all the different doctrines you were mentioning in dialogue with each other. And indeed, state loyalty is the key criteria for being authorized to speak. And then different level of doctrines, so really kind of pieces of texts with references to some Russian author or to foreign author. All these different elements have been mostly in competition with each other for decades. And when you talk to their own author in Russia, they will give you the impression of a heavy competition, right? For the marketplace in Russia, the market for ideas in Russia is a pretty tough one, with groups competing with each other. I think gradually there is the feeling that everybody find a little niche for themselves in the markets, but you have indeed different pieces of doctrines and different visions of Russia that can contradict each other. You mentioned the ethnic element, so a more kind of ethnic Russian Russia versus a more multinational, celebrating diversity, multiplicity of nationalities and religion aspect. You have an opposition between a more secular tradition of Russia or a more religious vision of Russia, which is something where I think you would really find divergence among the Russian authorities, government bodies, and intellectual and the societies in the relationship to the West. Indeed, especially now with the new Trump administration, I think we see, so those who said, well, if the conservative West is willing to talk to us, then we should re-engage and reaffirm we are also the conservative Europe, at least, or the old-fashioned West. And others who said, no, as you said, we spend so much time being linked to the global South, developing this anti-colonial narrative that even if the conservative West is talking to us, is still in decline, and the future is not in the West, conservative or not. The future is with the non-West world. So all these different pieces, they try to speak to each other, they compete with each other, but they are still were able to be put in a kind of pyramidal language by the state where everybody has its little niche, you know, those who care for memory politics, the Second World War, those who care for Tsarism, those who care for Soviet great power, you know, technological successes. So everybody can play with that as long as indeed you respect one umbrella, which is loyalty to the state and loyalty to the current authorities.
By the way, just for the audience, please put your questions in the Q&A, write them that you see at the bottom of the screen, and I will pass them on to Marlene. Now, in your book, you also talk, though, about a doxa, certain absolutely basic principles that everybody who wants to be in the regime, or certainly in the foreign and security establishment, do have to obey and be loyal to. That of course is by no means unique to Russia. You see it in India, you see it in China. Well, until Trump, of course, you saw it in America. Now things look a bit different. But can you say something about this basic doctrine, this doxa, without adherence to which you're not a member of the Russian establishment under Putin?
Yeah, I see several elements of this kind of basic worldview, right? One is that the state is the bearer of the nation, so the state needs to be strong for the nation to survive. So strong state is what gives you legitimacy, historical continuity, you know, sovereignty. So it's linked to the sovereignty argument, which is very important for Russia. A second one would be a realist interpretation of the international scene and a kind of civilizationist interpretation of the international scene. So you have different group of civilization. They are all different. There is no way they can be unified. They should be respected. That is linked with the notion of, you know, they are kind of sphere of influence on which a great power has kind of a say in what is happening around. Conservative values in a very complex way, like the societies cannot be transformed too fast. And I think that's a legacy of the 90s, of course, and of the violence of the 90s transformation, is that changes is okay, it's possible, but it needs to be slow, organic, consensual, and not something that is too radical, divisive, and coming from abroad. And then patriotism, right? The society should be supportive of the state. So personal opinions are possible, divergence are possible, but in a limited space where citizens should be supporting of what the state is thinking is the best way for the country and the nation to survive. So I would see like these kind of 4 elements are being key. And then they can be, you can have different declension of them intellectually, ideologically, with different coloring, but they are there everywhere.
Speaking as somebody who's half Irish, so I've noticed this, as you might say, at home. But of course, human beings are very complex animals, and you know, certain things only emerge after a considerable number of drinks and then go away again, with a hangover in the morning. And I was thinking of this fascinating concept of the catechon, which is by no means deeply held by every Russian and not by many people all the time, but which does seem to lurk there at moments of, shall we say, heightened emotion. Can you tell us something about the catechon?
Yeah, it's an important notion. I think that has been growing in the Russian kind of political language that is connecting to Christianity, to Orthodoxy, to the kind of Byzantine legacy, and this idea that Russia is a shield, a kind of fortress for traditional Europe, conservative values, organicist kind of vision of the universe, civilizationism. So this notion of being a shield, I think, has become very important because it's also allowed for bringing religious arguments, or something that looks like sacred, into a very secular political language for long. And I think indeed it has been growing all this over this last decades, let's say, and it's become very visible with the war, because the war brought some kind of eschatological language about politics and the tension with the West. But I think it's widely shared by the population, not under the catechon narrative, which is something very intellectual for a very small group, but the idea that, Russia is the country of common sense. And I use that term specifically because it's also used in the US by the Trump administration, a country that, where you have this kind of grassroots common sense that is still there, and we try not to change too fast, and we think twice before making moves that would be too radical, and the society. So a kind of intuitive conservatism, in a sense that doesn't need any kind of intellectual articulation. I think that is widely shared by the population without the intellectual construction of the catechon on the side. Yeah.
Yes, because originally, of course, the catechon was a Byzantine Christian concept about the Roman Empire, or what was left of it, holding the Antichrist in check. By the way, I mean, not in principle an idea alien to considerable sections of the US population. But yes, I mean, that as such is not one I've heard from ordinary Russians. But of course, the idea that the Russian state is a bulwark against constantly threatening chaos, and also insane intellectual and, well, not so much intellectual, of course, as intellectual political experimentation. These are things which are deeply rooted in Russian society because, tragically, they're deeply rooted in Russian history.
Yeah, absolutely. I think both the experience of the Soviet Union and the kind of social engineering of the Soviet Union, plus the collapse of the Soviet Union and the re-social engineering of the 90s, really created this very strong feeling that, okay, the societies and the state are very often at risk of collapsing because of this very heavily rapid transformation, then interpreted as coming from abroad or coming from home. That's another aspect. So I think there is indeed this kind of feeling that experimenting with social, the social fabric and human beings is something dangerous, precisely because that society has been going through it several times along in the 20th century. And now, of course, the kind of ideological formulation of that is that liberalism as a political construct and as a geopolitical reality of Western liberal order has been an element of chaos on the international scene. And Russia has been trying to act as the place that would be kind of stabilizing the international scene. And that, I think, is also something that is very widely shared by the Russian elite, whatever they think about, the war and the justification for the war, but the idea that a US-led unipolar order has been destabilizing the world more than stabilizing, and that Russia's role is to stabilize, which is indeed a kind of interpretation of Cateron applied to international scene, I think is very widely spread.
I mean, a key problem, I think, in Western analysis, I mean, particularly, I mean, this was a curse in the 1990s and indeed after, was this notion of a normal country. And when you ask people what a normal country is, you know, first they would say America, and you had to burst out laughing. Sometimes they said Britain, and of course, as a Brit, I would hoot with laughter. And then they would eventually say, well, you know, either like Fukuyama, Denmark, or New Zealand as one. And well, obviously, Russia was not going to be either of those things, whatever happened. So, I mean, to what extent do you think that a measure of difference from Western countries does simply inevitably derive from Russia's particular geographical, but by the same token, geographical cultural position, you know, on the periphery of Europe, between Europe and Asia? Is this something which is to some degree just fixed by, yes, I mean, geography itself?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are elements that matter. It doesn't mean that they are a curse and that you cannot do anything with that. You can absolutely change them, but you have realities indeed. The space of Russia is a very specific one. The way Russia is located between different civilization, if we want to use the Russian terminology, is also something. Then historic tradition has been very specific, right? The multinationality of Russia has been also an important element. So, and indeed the kind of peripheral relationship to Europe that you would find in Turkey also as a kind of interesting parallel, I think has always created this really deep resentment among the Russian elites that they always have to position themselves toward Europe and that it's the only criteria, and they have been trying as often as possible to find other criteria to look at, but that is of course difficult because the Russian culture and politics has been so much European by many aspects. Even if it's to define themselves against it, it's still the key criteria. So I think it remained. I think probably in the 90s, the way, you know, the Soviet Union collapsed also around the idea of the reunification with Europe and the return of Russia to the European home has been something difficult. And if you look back to the 90s, you could already see this kind of misinterpretation, misunderstanding between the West imagining some form of return or normalization of Russia by their own criteria, and the way the Russian society and even the Yeltsin government was interpreting what normalcy means. And I think for me, it's really an important element because if you follow Putin's over 25 years, right, the multiple Putins we had over 25 years, I think the quest for normalcy, but a normalcy that wouldn't be a pure kind of absorption of Russia into Western scheme that wouldn't fit what Russia is, has been a really important element. So on many aspects, including the ideological construction, has been an attempt to find a good normalcy for the Russian society to function in a new world that would be globalized with no more the kind of the Soviet ideological rigid system against the West. So they tried many times, I think, to find a way to create that normalizing Russia. And there has been a deep resentment about like, we failed, the West failed to help us finding that. And now we have found that normalcy in a sense by decoupling with the West.
Well, there have been a number of questions from the audience about this. I mean, to what extent can one attribute this very noticeable shift on the part of Putin? I mean, within this general framework of doxa, as you've said, to what extent has that been the fault of the West? I mean, obviously, since the end of the Cold War, but to some extent, even perhaps before. Certainly, I mean, there were very powerful elements in the West which never wanted to recognize the reality of the Khrushchev thaw, for example, though then, of course, under Brezhnev, that was reversed to a considerable extent. But how far have we basically expelled Russia and forced it to develop different or hostile ideas.
Yeah, I think of course the West also played a role, and in a sense it's a shared failure. Right? The war, arriving to the war situation has been a shared failure by both Western and Russian elites. I think there have been, as I was saying, a lot of misunderstanding since the 90s. And indeed, inside Western actors, there was always, among some of them, the idea that Russia has to be external to it, that Russia doesn't have a say to the European security architecture, for example. And that, I think, was a key disagreement that was already there under Yeltsin, and that some of the Yeltsinian elites, even when they were pro-liberal, pro-Western, were already feeling that there would be element of tension. So I think we had a responsibility, and that's why for me, it's really important that was important in the book, to try to have a chronology of these 25 years of Putin in power, to realize that the situation we had now with the war was not written in the DNA of Putin's arriving in power in 2000, right? It's a co-creation. Putin is a co-creation of us, also the West, and what Russia has become has been also co-created by us. And so there was other trajectories, other futures that were possible, and then gradually we closed this future as the West and Russia to arrive to the kind of terrible situation we had in 2022 or in 2014, if we want to begin with the first kind of clash.
Well, that leads to another question from the audience, which is, if, pray God, the war can be brought to a more or less peaceful resolution, and basically, if not amicable, at least, coexistence can be reestablished between Russia and, well, the West. Hard perhaps to say what the West is now, but certain key Western countries. Do you think that gives the chance, not of a return to the 1990s, but would that promote a modification of the balance of existing ideologies in Russia, and a shift of the regime towards either the conservative Westerners or what you've described, I think, as the pro-state liberals or the patriotic liberals? I mean, is there a chance? How far? Because, of course, as you were saying, there's a huge debate within Russia itself. But what would your view on this be? I mean, is the future still to some extent open from that point of view?
I think for that point of view, yeah, I think it's still open. I would dissociate, of course, finding a kind of ceasefire of peace. It's one thing. I don't think Russia would feel it has solved what has been their key issue over the years, which is what they call the European security architecture. And I think on that, and that's one element that makes the negotiation so difficult now, is that the Russian wants a broader discussion of what Europe's security should be, and not only a settlement of the war in Ukraine. So I think they will probably continue to feel very unhappy, even if there is a ceasefire or peace settlement, about the kind of the lack of mechanism that would be shared between Russia, Europe, and the US about what do we want to do in Europe together. On their domestic side, I think you still have the future is not written, and it can go in different direction. I think we could continue with a very relatively anti-Western, anti-liberal narrative, continuing to say we are in a kind of spiritual, civilizational war with the West, even if something is settled in Ukraine. We could see something softening and saying, okay, we can re-engage with some elements in the West, the conservative ones, so probably with the US under Trump, but less with the Europeans who are considered as on a more kind of aggressive stance, and continue to have the opening toward the global South. So I think there are tensions between these different narratives, but you could also imagine having them functioning together for different audiences internationally and for different audiences at home. You will have a small part of the Russian population that will continue to be very tough on the West and in a kind of a war atmosphere or post-war atmosphere that will continue to see the West as an enemy, whatever. You will have people looking, and part of the society looking for, kind of back to some form of normal and normalcy, including re-engaging on some aspect with the West, and a group of people who will continue to say, well, you know, we can re-engage with the West, but the West doesn't matter so much anymore on the international scene. And what counts now is really the kind of outside of the West globalization of Russia. So I think you could have the three lines still being present, both at the elite level and among the society in terms of audience.
Now, you have said that Russia is not fascist, and that is true, but you've also noted that there are fascist elements, even, you know, within what you might call the pro-regime coalition. Could you say something about these fascist strains and how, I mean, how they've been exploited by the regime, but also how their version of Russian nationalism differs from that of, it seems, Putin himself?
Yeah, I think there has been tension on the way, and that's always a question for us as writers, scholar, external observer, about what do we define as the Russian state, the Russian regime, how much we want to be, to have a restrictive definition of it or a kind of inclusive, expanded one. I think you can identify some elements of some groups in Russia that indeed have a kind of what you would call as we would define academically as having some fascist feature. It can be grassroots groups that have been mostly repressed. You were mentioning ethno-nationalism, a lot of kind of skinhead, radical ethno-nationalist groups that were fitting very well the definition of being fascist on one way or another, have been largely repressed. Some of them are shifted on the Ukrainian side, fighting against Russia. So they are part now of the Ukrainian kind of foreign legion, fighting against Russia in the name of fighting against an empire, in the name of liberating the ethnic Russians. So that's one aspect, with all the paradox it may mean for them to be fighting for Ukraine also. And then inside the system, you have groups who have really a kind of fascist feeling of violence is necessary for regenerating the nation. Violence is the only element that can give us results. Society should be ultra mobilized, radicalized, transformed. So you have these groups, they have patrons inside the system, they have a voice, they are there. I don't think they are the majority. I think they are pretty much under control, but there are moment of tension. In the last 3 years, you see them emerging of course, in their violence, also against the Ukrainian nation and what they define or refuse to recognize as being the Ukrainian nation, and in the tension they want to put in Russia itself on the society. And they have been complaining about Putin and the government being too soft, too moderate, both in its war goals in Ukraine and in its indoctrination and mobilization of the Russian society. So this group of people are there. I just don't think that they are representing the Russian state and the Russian regime in its, or even less the Russian society in its kind of broad definition.
Because Putin, it seems, has always been deeply aware of the need to keep sort of establishment or conservative Muslim figures and institutions on side with the Russian state, and he's, you know, he stressed, you know, the central role and importance in the Russian state of these different, I can't remember the formulation, but basically established traditional religions as against both, obviously, Islamist radicals, but also certain kinds of Western missionaries. And but has the Ukraine war brought about a shift from that point of view towards ethnic nationalism? And how dangerous is this, in your view, within Russia?
So I think Putin indeed was always really careful about, and had a lot in all his speeches, really regularly mentioned ethno-nationalism, Russian ethno-nationalism, at the risk of the kind of destruction of Russia. So that element was always there. And I think he also had a very strong feeling that if you open the Pandora box, or kind of far-right revolutionary militarized vigilante groups, you take also the risk of losing control of them. And then you can create this kind of vicious circle where they are destabilizing the state structure themselves. So I think he has been very well aware. And that is a real counter-revolutionary oriented person, is that he knows the risk of a revolutionary far right for his own regime stability. And then, of course, what the war has been bringing, and it was there since before, since we can discuss when it's really arrived, but it was there at least very visibly a few years before the full-scale invasion, the kind of growing narrative of interpreting what the tension with Ukraine, not only as a geopolitical issue about NATO expansion and the European security architecture, but a growing narrative about Ukrainian identity and nation and state as being illegitimate because they are part of a kind of broader Eastern Slavic group. And that indeed is sending very mixed signal about this kind of paradoxical, but in a sense, that's what Russia has been historically as an empire, is to have this paradox of having this kind of Eastern Slavic push, where it's looking outside in trying to integrate other slaves, and at the same time, the kind of Eurasianist tradition that is looking at groups that are considered as outside of this Slavic ethnicity, but still part of the empire, right? So you have both this narrative of sometimes having Putin mentioning the ethnic assimilation, ethnic unity with Ukrainians, while at the same time saying for domestic audience, when he's talking about what is happening in South Russia, saying, but everything that is Ruski can be dangerous if he explodes nationalism, it should be Rastiski, so kind of have multi-ethnicity. So that's what Russia is as a kind of post-empire. It has multiple layers of identity that do not overlap. And so non-ethnic Russians can be welcome in Russia, and they are as ethnic minorities. And at the same time, there is this kind of form of irredentism toward external citizens, interpreted as should be our internal citizens. So, and Ukraine is really the unique case in that side.
I mean, since the war, or indeed since 2014, I've found, deeply confused feelings about Ukraine and Ukrainians in Russian society as a whole, among ordinary Russians, because, there is the strong element of hostility, of course, to the government in Kiev and to what they have presented to themselves as Ukrainian nationalist extremists. But of course, it's as various people have said, some of them Russians with Ukrainian names. It's very hard to. This is not, in any real sense, a genocidal feeling, because of course so many Russians have Ukrainian names, or are married to Ukrainians, or Ukrainians married to Russians, or whatever. And it's been suggested that the regime was moving perhaps in a more anti-Ukrainian direction in its rhetoric, and then realizing that that was not in fact very popular or going down well, swung to this very strong anti-Western rhetoric, partly as a way precisely of dodging that issue. So we're not at war with the Ukrainian people because they are our brothers, etc. We are at war with the West.
Absolutely, and that has been very well documented for the first month of the full-scale invasion in 2022, when the media, the state media narrative shifted from we are fighting Ukrainians to we are fighting the West and Ukrainians are just the poor proxy in the middle, because indeed, as you said, it would be hurting Russia's own narrative and this feeling of really shared brotherhood that is really important for many people in Russia. And what I found interesting is that when you look at surveys, even done, like 2023, 2024, the number of Russian citizens who consider Ukraine and Russia are the same and Ukraine should be joining Russia is very minimal, which means that Putin's own arguments is in fact not necessarily shared by the large part of the population, that people identified Crimea and Donbass as being there. Now I think you have the majority of the population that would say yes. But the whole of Ukraine is still totally perceived as an external state for the majority of Russians, which means it's a good case of showing that what the state is trying to promote is not necessarily bought by the population, right? People can decide what they want to believe, what they don't want to believe. And there are some elements that there is no way you can make them believe, because that indeed doesn't fit. So it gives us kind of some, nuances, granularity on what is the Russian public opinion. And on that, we see it very clearly that, yeah, Crimea, Donbass for sure, but the rest of Ukraine is not considered as being part of Russia, or should be being part of Russia.
Well, I mean, I hope that this will act as a constraint on the Russian government in its ambitions in Ukraine, because you had, I found, tremendous consensus in Russia against surrender, or what they would see as surrender, defeat in Ukraine. But yes, I mean, if you look at the opinion polls, but also ones at my own conversations, only a minority want, total victory or the conquest of the whole of Ukraine. And so, perhaps if Trump can come up with a viable peace settlement, it would be difficult, perhaps, for Putin simply to reject that and go on. Unless, of course, that the Ukrainians and Europeans reject it, at which point, well, then,
Yeah, which is a possible option. Well, I'm not sure there are so much constraints in kind of details of what the public opinion would be thinking, because they can frame a victory, I think, pretty easily in the current context with almost every kind of adaptation, and the large part of the population will kind of accept that interpretation of being a victory because people want a peace. Where I think they are constrained is that they don't want full mobilization of their population, because that they know that would put the regime security in danger. And I think for me, it's the last criteria, right? Is that it's not the war at any cost. If the war is costing the regime security, then the war is not worth it. And I think that's why they have been also avoiding mobilization. And so if they feel that, you cannot gain more without moving to really mobilizing both militarily and ideologically your whole population, that I think that they know they shouldn't be doing that, and they are not ready for that. And there will be tension inside the establishment for not going toward that way. So that, I think, is an element of kind of restraint on the Russian side.
Yes, and I mean, obviously, a tremendous obstacle to their progress militarily on the ground as well. They've only mobilized a fraction of their potential manpower.
Yes.
Several questions from the audience about the influence of 19th century or pre-revolutionary Russian thought. One question about how far, Uvarov's famous formulation works for Putin: autocracy, orthodoxy, and then, of course, well, the third element has always been debated what it actually means, sabornost. And then a question about which pre-revolutionary philosophers, this endless question about, how far Ilyin is a key figure intellectual figure for Putin. And then a related thing, I mean, how important, in fact, is Dugin? He always pops up, but he's been invited to all sorts of official things, but then Dugin's spirit is very different from that of Putin, to put it mildly. So how far do you think that pre-revolutionary ideas have come back and are critical?
Well, at least intellectually, they really have come back. If you look at journals like Titradì per Conservatismo, they really did a lot of work in kind of rediscovering, redebating all the big historical names. So Danilevsky and Leontiev are probably the most quoted because they have the civilizationist aspect that really matter. Ivan Ilyin, among the kind of émigrés, so it's not pro-revolutionary, but it's émigré, has been widely rediscovered. There would be other names also, just classic, Karamzin interpretation of the Russian state. And of course, Uvarov, Pobedonostsev, that have been the state as the core value and state centrism as a core value of Russian society, I think, has been rediscovered. So there have been several authors, and of course, all the kind of Silver Age authors, Solovyov, Berdyaev, have been kind of largely rediscovered. So there has been a lot of borrowing from the West and reading, what Western conservative voices and thinkers have been producing. But they did a real work in rediscovering their own kind of philosophical tradition of conservatism, which was huge in the 19th century, and kind of trying to reinterpret that. And if you follow what the Russian institutions are supporting in terms of, funding historical movies, historical miniseries, you can see a real kind of rediscovery and promotion of 19th century Russia that is happening also at the cultural level. So I would say big names of the 19th century, Silver Age, emigration have been the key figure, have a kind of key doctrinal contribution. Dugin, yeah, classic topic. I think I'm saying that each time I ask the question, really overestimated influence coming from Western actors. If you talk to people in Russia, they would really kind of see them as a marginal figure because he has been too radical on many aspects. He's not relying on all this Russian traditional name for conservative thinking. He's relying on Western far-right thinker, very often connected to the fascist past of Europe, like Julius Evola. So it's not an easy doctrinal element to bring into the Russian framework. Is considered too radical, too esoteric. So he has been partly rehabilitated and reintegrated with the full-scale invasion, with the assassination of his daughter. He has this small center at RGGU in Moscow, named after Ivan Ilyin, trying to do kind of, indoctrination, reorganization of social sciences, de-Westernization of the intellectual landscape, but it's pretty minor if you look at, who is in charge of writing the textbook, who is in charge of reformulating the key element that will then be integrated into textbook. He's not there, right? He talks, he has more visibility in the media than before the full-scale invasion, but he's still a marginalized figure. He doesn't have big kind of institutional status. There are other names that we know less usually, but who are more kind of technocratic, bureaucratic interpretation of how you craft an ideological content, and they are much more influential than he is.
And going back to Avarov and the second part of his triad, orthodoxy, how important is religion to the regime, and how far is there actually a distance there?
Yeah, I think religion matters as the cultural product, as the value element, right? It's the Russian Orthodox Church is kind of giving Russia its uniqueness, kind of historical continuity, value set, but it's not about religion in itself. It's not about faith. And you can see that on many aspects, there is a gap between what is the Russian state logic and what is the church logic, right? The church care for re-Christianizing its own citizen, mostly, which is a painful process for the church to do because it doesn't work very well. That's not exactly the goal of the state. So they work together in kind of trying to move the society toward the state support patriotism, but they have disagreement. They have disagreement on value set. The Russian Orthodox Church is much more conservative than what the Russian state is ready to accept in terms of, discussion on abortion, women's rights, domestic violence. So they have this disagreement, and then they have big disagreement in terms of kind of interpretation of the Soviet past, with the church really pushing for a very strong, at least until recently. Now, maybe within the last 3 years with the war, the church has to kind of scale down its opposition on memory politics. But for very long, the church was very critical of Stalinism. For example, the state was trying to be in a much more nuanced position, recognizing the Gulag, at the same time kind of excusing the state violence. So it's a marriage of convenience. It's not a perfect honeymoon. And the society is ready to embrace, respect for the church as the cultural institution that matters, but not to have the church intervening in their private life in terms of sexuality, morality, and so on.
And communism, another question. what is the enduring influence of communism? And of course, you mentioned you know the very complicated attitudes to Stalin, but of course, Putin, if there's one thing that he does not sympathize with, it's revolution and mutiny. And I was so amused, but it was also rather sad in a way. The shock among not just much older Russians, but even middle-aged Russians. You've probably seen this film Soyuz Spasenia about the Decembrists, very much a state-sponsored film. And of course, for all these people, the Decembrists were the heroes. I mean, because they're quite, you know, unconditional heroes, the ones on whom there were no shadows and no darkness, and, you know, patriots as well as revolutionaries. And the shock when you saw a film in which the heroes were Nicholas I and Miloradovich. But clearly, I mean, Putin does not sympathize instinctively with the Decembrists. But what does he sympathize with in the communist legacy?
Well, I think it's kind of, yeah, anti-revolutionary, anti-Bolshevism, but kind of pro-great power. So I think the elements that play a role is that when state matters in communism, so it's of course more the Stalinist period, where you have great power, where you have a redistributive state, and you have social justice and a kind of conservative law and order system. And I think that's his element that really speaks to a large part of the society. If you look at what are the elements of nostalgia for the Soviet regime, right? It's very much the kind of redistributive aspect, the kind of social equality, social justice, and the kind of conservative law and order and great power. So that's the key element that remains. Everything else is indeed a refuse, and everything that looks revolutionary is deeply refused. And Putin has been very explicit several times at kind of being very negative on Lenin as someone who put the Russian state survival at risk and took the risk of destroying it.
And a question about after the end of the war, and this applies, we're not discussing Ukraine today, but tremendously to Ukraine as well. What do you think will be the impact of the returning veterans in Russian society? And could they introduce or not introduce, but boost a much harsher version of Russian nationalism? Is this something, you know, really to be afraid of? And from that point of view, is there also a risk of, but in a political sense, more Prigozhin-like figures emerging, or did Putin settle that question once and for all, as he settled?
Yeah, I think that's really an important question, and that indeed will have an impact, a huge impact on the Russian society. So first, you will have hundreds of thousands of men coming back with post-traumatic disorder, very few medical structure ready to help them. It will have an impact on domestic violence. For example, you will have men who have been trained to violence and to using weapons everywhere in Russia. So that will have an impact. I think we will see things we saw at the end of every war, right? The first one in the First World War in Europe, especially, that you will have brotherhood of veterans that will be trying to act as vigilante, trying to find their niche in a kind of paramilitary, you know, civilian jobs. So everything that would be patriotic military institution, they will try to enter the charity, you know, world, everything where you interact with the society. Some will be able to have a political career, and you can see already the regimes trying to prepare the return of some veterans and kind of promoting them as kind of the new elite, the one that had demonstrated its loyalty because they were on the front line, and that can have a kind of fast track promotion inside a state administration and politics. But I think, of course, the flow will be really important. And so the majority of men will have difficulties returning to civilian life, as in any case. And so you will have a market for mercenaries jobs all over the world, not only in Russia. They will be exporting themselves. So you have a risk of more violence inside the Russian society, more pressure put on the political regime, with probably veterans organizing themselves as a political force and trying to make pay those who stayed behind and kind of didn't really supported the war effort. So there will be a lot of intra-elite tension, potentially tension also at the grassroots level, and indeed more kind of the Prigozhin type of kind of challenging the elites who didn't participate in the war and asking for a higher level of recognition. I think all these elements will be there. I think the authorities are very well aware of that, and I don't think that I don't think they are planning for a kind of full rapid demobilization. Even if we would have a ceasefire or a settlement, I think, of peace, I think they would keep a lot of these men somewhere on the border and very gradually release them back to civilian life, because the flow will be absolutely huge. I mean, Ukraine, as you said, will have the same issue, but we are discussing Russia here, and indeed it will have an impact, and people are very stressed. I mean, if you follow kind of everyday conversation in Russia, among Russians about what would be the end of the war, the stress of veterans coming back, I think, is very much there, because I think there is a kind of collective memory of the moment where, you know, the doors of gulags open and you had millions of men suddenly going back, men mostly, going back home after years in prisons, and that really shaped the Soviet society in the 50s. And I think this collective memory of this flow of men is still there, and people are stressed. So I think it will be a real challenge for the regime, and I think they are preparing, you know, in trying to find a way to deal, but the flow will be huge, and they will need to put a lot of money and structure and goodwill in trying to deal with that issue.
Another question from the audience, possibly the last one, because we're running out of time, but the impact of the rise of China. I mean, how do you see the balance within the Russian establishment between dependence on China, fear of China, admiration for China? Is the Chinese model now itself beginning to shape Russian ideology? How do you see this relationship in intellectual terms?
Yeah, I think it's a complex one, and we tend in the West to see it in a very black and white, you know, either they love each other and they do everything together, or they hate each other and they will be at war with each other. I think it's much more complex. I think the Russian elite has a much more kind of pragmatic analysis of the relationship. They know that economically they are not at the level of what China can do, and they know that they need Chinese investment. At the same time, I had the impression they feel pretty okay with the disbalance, because they feel they have been able to open to other countries of the global south. They often mention India. They mention their relationship with, you know, Emirates or smaller kind of more regional power as a kind of way to counterbalance the predominance of China. So I think they feel they can manage that. I think, of course, maybe in 10, 20 years, depending how it's evolved, it will change. But my impression is that for the moment, they feel it's manageable. The dependency is there, but it's still not a kind of full dependency on China. They still have their room of maneuver with other countries, even if it's not the West. And in terms of admiration, I think an admiration for the way China deal with tension on the international scene, probably. An admiration for a kind of communist regime, one-party type, that I don't think. I think they lack the flexibility and the informality of the Russian political regime, and because it gives more flexibility, and you have more room for different subgroups organizing themselves. So I don't think there is admiration for the kind of communist regime. There is admiration for the capacity of controlling society, the kind of internet sovereignty, and the capacity at growing on the international scene.
Yes, one should never underestimate. And I mean, this also, of course, explains so much Russian authoritarianism and autocracy, but one should never underestimate the capacity of Russian society to generate anarchy. I mean, I'm not talking here in terms of, you know, evil chaos, but there is a certain innate resistance to actually being ordered, which is very un-Chinese, I find.
Yeah, and as we said, you know that formula in Russian that, you know, the government or the laws are tough, but kind of corruption and informality that is there to soften them. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Marlene, thank you so much. That was a fascinating discussion. I do hope that, people like you can introduce, more nuance, more flexibility, more seriousness, to the Western discussion of Russian ideologies. And I urge everyone to read your book, which is a truly wonderful introduction to these themes. So thank you, and my thanks to the audience.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you for the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.